Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Melissa Hafaf, and I'm the program director for the Gender Plus Justice Initiative. We are a cross-campus effort whose mission is to support and nurture research and projects related to intersectional gender justice. Feel free to visit our website, join our mailing list if you want to find out about future events and programs. We also love to collaborate. Today's program is presented by us, the Gender Justice Initiative, the Department of African American Studies, and the Women of Color Collective at the Georgetown University Law Center. And we are delighted to host a very timely conversation entitled Black Women Activists, Voters, and Politicians. We have a phenomenal panel of scholars today whose work is at the intersection of political science, African American studies, and in gender studies. I will first start with introducing our moderator for the conversation today, who is Professor Jamil Scott, who is an assistant professor of government at Georgetown University. Dr. Scott's research interests lie in the areas of political behavior, political representation, race and ethnicity politics, and gender politics. Her work seeks to explain individuals' motivations to participate in political activities in conventional ways, such as candidates and office holders, as well as in conventional ways, like protest and political engagement via social media. Moreover, Professor Scott examines the behaviors of office holders within office as means of understanding political representations and behavior within institutions such as legislatures. Dr. Scott is currently working on a book in which she seeks to understand Black women's political emergence in state-level politics. And now I will give the mic to Professor Scott, who will introduce our wonderful panelists today.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm happy to be here with you all today, and especially to be engaged with these great panelists that we have. We are waiting for one more, but I'm hoping that she'll be able to join us as I introduce our panelists that are here with us. I'll start with Dr. Nadia Brown, who is a professor of political science and African American studies at Purdue University. In July 2021, Dr. Brown will join Georgetown University in the Department of Government and as the director of the Women and Gender Studies program. Dr. Brown's research includes intersectionality, Black women's politics, Black politics, gender and politics, and gender and political science. She has been the recipient of a National Science Foundation Advanced Partnership Grant for her contribution to Me Too Poli-Sci, leveraging a professional association to address sexual harassment in political science, as well as for the Women Also Know Stuff initiative. Dr. Brown has written several publications that examine the intersections of gender, race, sexuality, and class in the United States. Brown's 2014 book, Sisters in the State House, Black Women in Legislative Decision Making, was the winner of the 2015 W.E.B. Du Bois Best Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, the winner of the 2015 Anna Julia Cooper Best Publication Award from the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, and was named one of the editor's picks 10 favorite book reviews from 2014. She is also the lead editor of Politics, Groups, and Identities, a journal of the Western Political Science Association. Dr. Dayo Gore is an associate professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. Her research interests include Black women's intellectual history, 20th century US politics and cultural activism, African American and African diasporic politics, and gender and sexuality studies. Dr. Gore is the author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, African American Women Activists in the Cold War, which charts the political commitments and strategic leadership of a network of Black women radicals operating with the US left from the 1930s through the 1960s. She is also the co-editor of Want to Start a Revolution, Radical Women in the Black Freedom Struggle, co-editor with Sarah Haley and Prudence Cumberbatch of a special issue of Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society, titled Black Women, Labor, Economics, Culture, and Politics, and most recently contributed an article to the collection, We Could Turn This Whole World Over, Black Women's Internationalism in the 20th Century, from University of Illinois Press. Her work has been supported by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, and the Tamiment Library and Robert Wagner Labor Archives at New York University. And now we have Dr. Pearl Dowe with us. And Dr. Pearl Dowe is a Georgia native and is currently the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Political Science and African American Studies with a joint appointment between the university's Oxford College and Emory College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Dowe's research includes African American political behavior, gender and politics, and African American political leadership. Most recently, she has focused on political ambition and public leadership in African American women. She is co-author of Remaking the Democratic Party, Lyndon B. Johnson as Native Son Presidential Candidate, and editor of African Americans in Georgia, a reflection of politics and policy reflections in the New South. She has published numerous articles and book chapters, presented widely at professional conferences, and gives frequent media interviews. She is co-editor of the National Review of Black Politics and is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Economics, Race and Policy and the Race, Gender, and Class Journal. So again, I'm very happy to have these panelists here with us today, all very accomplished and certainly able to speak and to engage in a really awesome conversation about Black women voters and politicians. So thank you all again for being with us here today. And I think the first question that I want to engage you all on is, could you tell us about Black women's past participation and political engagement as citizens, activists, organizers, and voters? I'll start with Nadia.
Thank you. So I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you for the Gender Plus and Justice program for inviting me. And I am thrilled to be with my future colleagues at Georgetown and to Pearl, my sorority sister, who shares several of research projects together. So I'm extremely honored to be here. So Black women's pathways to elected office in some ways mirrors what we see in other racial and ethnic minority women. However, Black women chart this special course because of enduring legacies of racism and sexism. So while all women are least likely to be asked to run for office, all women are least likely to think of themselves first as a viable candidate. Black women have draw from different sources of political inspiration. They draw from different networks. They draw from different communities in order to run for office. So their pathways look a little bit different, particularly drawing from Indigenous Black women's networks, such as churches or sororities or social organizations, as their main source of support or financial backing. Black women also face some challenges in getting party support, so the financial resources that they require to mount a successful campaign. And in doing so, they often have to rely on smaller, less frequent donations in order to do so.
Dr. Gore?
So I guess I'll answer it from a more historical perspective and just give us maybe a brief timeline to think about and some of the key figures and movements around sort of voting and organizing and seeing that political engagement as a part of a multi-tiered step, particularly for activists. See it as one of the many rungs in an effort to gain liberation and power in the United States. And obviously we can think about the suffrage movement, which is this is the 100-year anniversary, so a lot has been written about it, but the ways in which Black women were central in that. You think about Ida B. Wells's determination to be involved in protests, even as majority white organizations said they weren't going to include Black women because of the color line. You think about Frances Harper's involvement and Sojourner Truth. So those are figures that I hope people know, but I'll shout them out anyhow, and sort of integral in making that. But also I think about their push for the 15th Amendment, even when it became clear that women weren't going to get the right to vote, that the end of slavery would provide the 15th Amendment where African American men would get the right to vote nominally, sort of technically, that Black women saw it as their task to push that vote and make it a collective vote, right? And there's a great article by Elsa Barkley Brown that talks about how Black women mobilized to make that not simply an individual vote, but a collective vote for communities. So I'll start there with the very beginnings of people's engagement. Black women were central to pushing that and seeing that as a part of the strategies of liberation. Obviously, we think about the civil rights movement, We think about Ella Baker's lifelong commitment from her work in the NAACP in the 30s on to the 40s to SNCC, to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, pushing both Black women's leadership, a more democratic form of leadership, right? But also mobilizing sort of Black power and voices, whether that was taking to the streets or taking to vote. And we can think about her involvement in something like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was integral in that as well, as using it as a two-pronged step, right? That they both were trying to demand more access in the Democratic Party, to demand access to vote in Mississippi, where they were often denied and it often met violent repercussions if they attempted to vote, but also seeing it as a movement building exercise to demand broader power and liberation and build community, collective efforts through that. And I think we can see that on to today, where I think one of the notable things about this election year is in 2020 is the ways in which community activists took the energy that was happening on the streets around Black Lives Matter, ending police violence, and mobilized it towards an electoral politics, but as one strategy among many in thinking about how you gain sort of Black liberation, how you make Black Lives Matter. So I'll stop there.
I would just add to particularly what Nadia just said, particularly around the fact that we see Black women entering political participation, not just only as voters, but with campaigns, and not just running their own. So Black women, as Nadia said, are often not recruited directly from the Democratic Party. But what both our research has shown is that these women are learning about politics through their community work. Many of them volunteer to help their friends run campaigns. And so they're getting this firsthand experience by doing what they do in their communities. And they're oftentimes recruited not by party people, but oftentimes by people who may be in a position that are not going to run again, or they are aspiring to move on to another position. So they're being recruited oftentimes by other Black women to actually say, hey, I'm not going to run for this. Can you fill this seat? But they often, as Nadia said, have to be asked over and over again in many cases. But then we also see that many of these women are self-starters. Many of these women, to what Dayo just mentioned, because of this commitment to community and to having this sense of efficacy, many of them don't need to be asked. They are putting themselves in the position to say, I see this is something I can do it better, and I'm going to do it. And because they have these community relationships, they are finding ways to overcome these obstacles, particularly because the fundraising. Many of them have access to in-kind support because they own their own businesses. They have relationships with other people that are contributing, donating campaign signs, literature, making phone calls. So they are coming in with their own campaign team. They don't need managers. Many of the women that I have interviewed for my research, they said they didn't need a campaign manager. They did it themselves, or they're someone that they know was able to do it for them. So they're finding these very informal ways of running these elections and actually doing very well, particularly on the local level. Now, I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about some of the congressional races that we didn't see as much success over the last few weeks. But on the local level, we see these women really utilizing the resources that the community relationships give them to be successful in these races.
Nadia, were you gonna add something here?
Yeah, I was just gonna make some linkages between Pearl and Dayo's comment, and kind of string together this lineage of Black women's activism as tried and true techniques that have sustained Black women in this country, even when political parties, when American democracy itself has said they don't want you, right? That so Dayo called on the names of Fannie Lou Hamer, right, of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And I'm making these or seeing these connections between how Fair Fight was started in Georgia and Stacey Abrams, a daughter of Mississippi, right, sharing some of these same kind of tactics to remove some of the voter suppression barriers that minority voters, particularly rural minority voters, have faced in Georgia at the hands of Brian Kemp, right, who was then Secretary of State and who's now governor. But we see this one party system of control that serves to basically reify white hetero patriarchy. And Black women are using indigenous organizing tools to find ways to challenge this, right? So this is this two-prong, this two-prong strategy that Dayo talks about. But then Pearl is, also linking this together to say that these are things that Black women have been doing without the help of others, right? So it's not the need of, let's say, if you're running for office, it's not the need of a campaign manager. It's not the need to have some kind of outside strategist come in, but that Black women are looking to themselves because other forms of support and systems aren't always available.
Well, thank you for that that linkage there. I think that lends really well into our next set of questions. And I think since we brought up Stacey Abrams, I think that would be a good place to go. I'll just add before I ask this question that for folks in the audience, please do feel free to ask questions to our very knowledgeable and amazing panelists here today. So to this question about Stacey Abrams, could you talk more about her work and her after law story and what it tells us about the political commitment beyond winning a race? And for Dayo in particular, could you speak to perhaps the historical lineage there, right? About, of organizing and what it means for Black women. I know Nadia spoke to this a bit, but I want to make sure that there is space for all of our great panelists to provide their amazing knowledge on this topic.
So when we look at Stacey Abrams, in 2013, Stacey Abrams, when she was a member of the state legislature, formed the New Georgia Project, in which she saw the demographics of the state and the issues of the state, and recognized that Georgia still continued the legacy of the South of not having a significant number of registered voters across race. And she saw that because of the issues within the state, that not only there was a need for registered voters, but that many of these voters possibly would be Democratic voters. And it was quite interesting that when she formed this organization, it was considered fraudulent. As she began to register voters, there were folks in the state that wanted to sue her, that were critical of where was this money coming from. She was actually beginning to tap into other organizations across the country to support these efforts. And so she was considered a fraud. And she was laughed at, like, how dare you think you can turn this good old red state blue? And so we see that this was a slow march to where we are today. And then when she runs for governor, as a result of the voter suppression efforts that have been ongoing in the state, particularly with voter purges that was occurring, particularly in the county surrounding Atlanta and within Atlanta, particularly DeKalb County, that she loses by a razor thin margin. But she continues to fight and begins to form Fair Fight, which is very interesting because Fair Fight is an extension of the New Georgia Project, but it adds the component of educating voters. So again, this efficacy that voters understand that not only do voters need to be registered, or potential voters need to be registered, but that they also had to understand their rights as citizens, and they had to understand the tactics of voter suppression so that they would not succumb and feel that their vote did not matter. And so it becomes this two-pronged effort of voter education and voter registration. And so with Abrams, this effort is very ironic in the fact that she doesn't just, bow down. And she talks about, as you read any of her articles, interviews, or you listen to her, when she talks about she went several days and she was upset, she was disappointed, she was hurt, she was confused. And then all of a sudden she realized she had to respond and understand that it was not her as a candidate, it was the suppression that had to be attacked. And so I think we see that she takes on this this dynamic in this fight, and it's become one that is a community fight, and that she does something that Black women typically do, that we see them doing this community base that Dayo talks about, that Fair Fight is not siloed, that it makes these inroads with many organizations that were already in communities throughout the state, that was attempting to do this work but did not have the resources to do it. So she takes her name recognition and the network that she had already formed with the New Georgia Project and brings in these smaller organizations. And so it becomes almost like an umbrella organization. And she really empowers these local groups, these smaller groups in these rural communities to continue to do the work and fuel the resources into it, and used her national spotlight to continue not necessarily talking about herself as possibly running for governor or senate, because she kind of squashes that early on, but the fact that voters had been disenfranchised and that there needed to be this dynamic. So I think she continues to this sense of um, this commitment to citizenship, right? That she's really talking about the rights of Georgians and people who have been disenfranchised, people who did not know their rights. So it's this fullness, I think, as far as what Fair Fight is about citizenship, and that this Black woman who had been cheated, right? That she really, continues this fight and really shows her commitment to citizenship for all citizens, and particularly Georgia and rural voters, because of her experience. And not only is her, I think, her experience in that election, but also her upbringing and seeing what her family went through and her parents went through, and understanding how people who, even when they have education or have access to certain resources, that they can still be disenfranchised and still be victims, particularly when we look at the voter purges in Georgia, that many people didn't even know they were purged, right? And that the right to vote was something that was being taken away if you didn't use it. But as she talks about, if you don't buy a gun or you have a gun license, you never lose the right to have a gun. So why is it that if you decide for whatever reason that you don't vote in this one particular election or two elections, that you lose that right, and you're not even informed that you have lost that right? So I think the Fair Fight example really speaks to Dayo's conversation about this commitment to citizenship, that we even talk about, why do Black women even have that commitment when society doesn't have that commitment to us?
I would just add that I think Pearl's point is really important because it speaks to the ways in which I think, in thinking about history and politics and social movements, we often only celebrate the victors. And I think there is an important lesson to be learned about the ways in which a seemingly a loss actually produces maybe even more profound political change, right? That in some ways, and I'm not celebrating her loss, and I'm definitely not saying that this winning in the presidential election didn't matter. I think it did. So don't get me wrong there. But I think historically, we think about Black women's involvement in politics and organizing. You think about someone like Charlotta Bass, who ran as vice president in 1952 with no hopes of sort of winning, ran on the Progressive Party ticket, a left party ticket in the midst of the Cold War and attacks on the left, but did so for strategic reasons, right? To actually enforce some political change and to build sort of space for people who had those politics. Or you think about Shirley Chisholm's run, right? That in part was not realistically thinking I was going to win, but had a strategic sort of purpose to it that was about producing political change in different ways. And I think often those narratives are very important. Even something like the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which made a big inroads, was not successful, but actually had a profound shift in both the political movements, right? How people thought about the strategies for gaining power, where they had to turn away from, in some ways, the Democratic Party and think of other options, right, when that became clear. So that I do think these moments where people suffer losses, particularly in politics, forced him to think of and one of the points I think Pearl made, think about citizenship differently, whether it's to think about how do I demand inclusion in that, or what are the limits of inclusion in that, right? And makes them think about how they engage the society and US politics more broadly. But I think it also allows them to think about other strategies for building collective sort of organizing and building sort of bases, right? And in some ways, Stacey Abrams' case is exactly on point, that her inability to win the governorship in the context of all this forced her to build a base differently, right? To think about how do I build my power and be a part of a collective process in a different way, right? Where do I actually have to understand the problem developing from? And I think it forces people to think about more strategically how do actually, as Black women, we engage and claim power in this society that often shuts the door on us, right? And how do we think creatively and strategically and actually recognize what power we do have, right? Because I think often the system that says you don't belong is also an effort to say you don't have any power. And I think Black women again and again have shown that they, in their creative and collective efforts, a real ability to locate where Black power, Black women's power emerges and is really can be built from. And so I think that's an important lesson. And oftentimes those are moments of loss where you're forced to reevaluate what you imagine is possible.
And I'll just quickly, as I see some questions coming in the chat, but this is our second presidential election since Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. And this, right, this preclearance where it was really allowed states, bad actors to marginalize minority voters. And right, this goes back to this limits of citizenship, right? When the federal government rolls away protections, states have oftentimes shown their true colors, right? That they are willing to use their powers to marginalize folks that they don't think are paying attention, that they think are not going to sway an election in their favor, in the favor of the party that's in power. And political parties are complicit in this, right? Because political parties don't know where non-registered voters are going to vote. They don't know, or who they're going to vote for. And the fear is an expanded electorate, right? Because no one can predict what that's going to look like. So our exit polls, our pre-polling numbers will look off, kind of, what we saw a couple of weeks ago. And it just makes the system, it makes the system uneasy. And so what Stacey Abrams is doing, what Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray, Annie Devine did was complicate this narrative, right? It's by opening up and expanding the electorate. And this is the thing that the system actually does not want. So when we ask these questions about what does Black liberation look like? How do Black women tap into this power? We also have to know they're doing this with all odds against them, right? So we're seeing these moments where the federal government walks away, or the federal government is down on its job, and and states are allowed, because states, there's no affirmative voting in the Constitution, right? This is all left up to states and how states decide how they will enfranchise their populations. And this is where we see these deep moments where states don't want to expand the electorate. And Black women see this as an opportunity to step in and fill this vacuum by doing this grassroots organizing that political parties don't want to do because it's not advantageous to them. They have no mandate, the states have no mandate from the federal government. So in this moment of, of lack of leadership, this is where Black women, unfortunately, right, have this time to shine.
Speaking of this point about political parties, our first question from the audience speaks to this now focus on Black women as being these steadfast and committed members to the Democratic Party. What is realistic for us to expect for Black women, given this, now focus on them, and what would be on your wish list for what the Democratic Party in particular should do for Black women?
Oh, well, I think everything's on the table, right? And I think that Black women are going to act and expect for everything. So I think we're seeing even now conversations about what a cabinet could look like, where there are conversations around Black women holding cabinet positions that have not been held before. So Marshall Fudge, possibly Secretary of Agriculture, and people are like, why would she want agriculture? She is on the Agriculture Committee, but agriculture also controls the distribution of funds for WIC and food stamps and other and food services and for poor families, for children to schools. So ag is extremely important when we talk about food insecurity, which is a significant issue for Black communities. Um, and so I think we're going to possibly see Black women in these type of positions that we have not seen them in before. I think we also should expect and need to see Black women, not just only Black women, but the Democratic Party, particularly with the DNC and their structure. We have not seen a Black woman as chair of the DNC. And I think the DNC also has to strengthen the resources that they provide to many of these organizations, because one of the things that we know about many of the organizations that do this type of get out the vote, voter mobilization, voter registration work, they oftentimes are waiting to the last minute to receive any type of support from the DNC. The DNC is heavily dependent on them to do this work. And so I think that there has to be a conversation about how the DNC supports these organizations to do the work that they're doing. Policy, right? Like women want to see policy. This is not just about putting people in positions. Putting people in positions is important, but we also want to see the substantive policies around these issues. And so it is promising to see the bio transition team being as diverse as it is, particularly with the COVID response, seeing Black doctors in that conversation, seeing even issues around they announced the team around economic development, seeing Black people who are experts and not just only figures, but we're talking about experts. There are Black people who are trained to do this work. And so we see Black people at the table at this phase. Hopefully that they will be able to develop policies. And one of the things that I think what Black women and Black people are saying is that, yes, you can talk about a universal, everybody's concerned about the economy. However, there are certain specifics that lead to why we face the issues that we face. And until someone is willing to have the political will and strength to say that it is fine to have a policy prescriptive that is unique to particular people, that is fine. And until someone does that, until they're pushed to actually do it, it's not going to happen. So hopefully that there's people that will be in these spaces that can help formulate policy that can really target the root of some of these issues, and that is not a one size fit all issue. What may work in Oakland, California, may not work here in the suburbs of Atlanta, right? And that's okay. But you have to have people that are trained and understand this, and Black women are in these positions that can really lend to that and really champion these conversations, and really hopefully we can see some positive implementation that can really benefit these communities in a way that, 4 years from now, maybe we will still have many of these conversations, but hopefully we will be at a better place when it comes to actual outcomes and be on a road to really addressing why we're seeing so many of these outcomes that we've seen historically for, really going back to really the 1930s, when we began to really look at or see some of these policies attempting to address some of these issues.
Yeah, and I'll quickly add that I think the first thing that Democrats should do, instead of thanking Black women with these, hollow acknowledgments, that they should do some of these policy prescriptions that Pearl has talked about. Obviously, Stacey Abrams can have any cabinet position that she'd want, or she should have the option, right, to do what's best for her. But if we really want to be serious about thanking Stacey Abrams, why don't the Democrats push legislation that will restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, right? So that there does not need to be fair fight. There doesn't need to be a new Georgia project in the same ways. If Black women are centered at policy tables, that means that the most marginalized are, right? Because we're taking this intersectional approach. So do things that will make marginalized communities safer, such as defund the police. Think about where the funding policies are going to and who is disproportionately hurt. What are ways that we can make families healthier? Well, Medicaid for all will do that, right? What are ways that we might think about how families can be stable and grow? Raise the minimum wage. And we're all concerned about the environment, but particularly those of us that live in that live in these environmental wastelands. So the Green New Deal is a policy that the Democrats could pass. Now, these are all progressive and leftist policies, but again, a rising tide lifts all boats. And if Black women are centered, right, if those are the margins are centered, these policies that will do the most good will actually help Black women as well.
And I guess I would just add, I think it speaks to a real question because I do think Black women represent a political spectrum. And I hope that the Democratic Party would take heed not only of Black women, but the grassroots that really help to Black women at the grassroots doing this organizing to bring in new voters, to bring in young people voting, to bring in people who are involved in organizing in the streets into supporting the Democratic Party, which was a profound difference than from the 2016 election. I think there was much more of a concerted effort among community organizers to strategically say, we're going to support this electoral process through the Democratic Party and to mobilize for that. And I think it made a profound difference. And I think Black women are at the key leadership of that, from Movement to Black for Black Lives, Work and Family Party, we can go on. And I really think Nadia's points are central to that. Will they actually make policy changes? Because I think there's a way in which historically they have Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. Maybe they'll give Stacey Abrams something and say the job is done. But if you can watch this election and 2016 and not think one of the key things is to address disenfranchisement of communities of color and Black communities, then I don't understand how you think about that as rewarding Black women, right? When that is the fundamental, one of the fundamental challenges we have, right? Historically and continues to this day. I think if you can't think about something like supporting the Breathe Act, which I think challenges the ways in which, even in a small scale, like it's not defunding the police or divesting in communities in broad ways. It does it in a much more constrained way, but it does make a step towards speaking to all of those people who went to the streets and protest and then went to the booths and voted for the Democratic Party. I think around healthcare in the midst of COVID, if you can't think about ways to provide economic security and healthcare for these communities, then it's really not speaking to not holding, Biden's not living up to his words when he says, I will always remember that Black folks have had my back. Because I think Nadia's point is very clear that those are the things that Black communities are struggling with and have been for years and have tried to sort of vote to support those, but often, too often, I think, even as the Democratic Party says it will lean that way, when it gets to the nitty gritty of it, when the rubber hits the road, those are the things that get jettisoned right away. And I think at this point, I do think if that happens, the Democratic Party will be in for a surprise, because I do think communities are willing to continue to push them, right, to do more, right, not willing to just accept a few nominal positions or some representation or nice music at the White House events, even though that feels good, you know. But they really, I think there will be a continued mobilization to push the Democratic Party, both on the local level, the state level, and the national level, to do more than simply provide sort of lip service to the voters that came out to support them.
Thank you for all of your responses here. I think our next audience question speaks to policy in one way, not in necessarily the way that we've talked about, but in terms of the Electoral College. So our audience member wants to know your thoughts on it, and does it further disenfranchise Black voters? And would a similar popular vote system be more empowering for marginalized voters? So there's a lot there.
Well, I would just say, because I know we want to make sure we get all the questions in. I mean, it's a structure that is designed to disenfranchise. That was the purpose of it, right? And initially, it wasn't to disenfranchise Black women or enslaved Africans who weren't allowed, who weren't even considered citizens. It was to disenfranchise illiterate white people, illiterate poor white who were not landowners. And so it's grounded in that history of the fact that there was a perspective that only a certain demographic, land owning white men, should be in control. And that's the foundation of that structure. And so if we're going to say that we really value citizenship of all people, all citizens, then we have to dismantle it. And it only benefits right now Republicans. If you see that over the last two elections, right? As far as when we begin to look at who votes and where people vote. One of the things that I like to look at, and what I'm glad that people are using, if you look at the new maps in which demographers are actually not showing a map based on a state boundary, but where people actually live. So when we look at population centers are where we have blue states or where we have these blue spaces. And so I think we look at from just where people are and who's actually voting, the popular vote is much more reflective than that oppressive electoral college map, which really, like I said, is grounded historically in repressing the vote and power of people who are deemed as not being worthy of citizenship through the vote.
I mean, I think clearly a question that everyone is engaged in.
Mhm.
I don't, it seems unlikely to change to me.
Yeah. Yes, the Constitution.
And I think there are a host of, I feel great, like for someone who studies US history, that people are interested in the politics of these systems. Because even if you think about something like the Senate, where it's not a representational vote, you think about, and I'll give a plug for my new state, DC, in the new place I'm moving, DC not having a representation. There are a whole host of structural ways in which inequality, and really, if we think about the founding of this nation, a suspicion of non-elites, right, which is at the foundations of a lot of this electoral college, how the Senate vote structure is, that was at the foundations of our founding, right, that the founding fathers were very worried about the yeoman farmer, to get too historical, having a sway, or the masses having a sway over the electoral structure. And that was mostly, as Pearl points out, not Black and brown people, because they were fully disenfranchised, but white farmers. So I think that's a history I'm glad to see people delving into, because it's profoundly at play today. Um, and I just think it speaks to, I think, something Nadia was talking about, the structural ways in which exclusion and disenfranchisement are built into the system, and and how it affects the marginalized, whoever they are, right? And I think in this moment, we see the real profound effect on poor working class folks, with the structures around voting, and then for a majority urban centers, right, that don't get the same representation as someplace like Wyoming or Montana, right, with their smaller representation, or someplace like DC or Puerto Rico, who get no representation. And I think often that coincides not only with the history of colonialism, but also the racial makeup of those places now, that we should take into account.
Yeah, and I don't need to belabor the point that both Pearl and Dayo have excellently made, but I also want to complicate this to note that there was times when Black folks were standing up and standing for the Electoral College, right? When states like New York were once in play, when New York was a purple state, those that live in New York City and the kind of the metro area around the city, or narrowly Black and brown, use their influence within the state party to say, now it's your time to listen to us, right? And so when they were blue, or when they were turning blue, or in that purple direction, minority communities were vested in the Electoral College. So both sides have been complicit, right? It's not pointing figures that we see today, right? That Republicans are more often use electoral, in modern history, or have used electoral college system to their advantage. But prior to that, Democrats were doing it, and minority communities were also championing this. So the system is structured for those that are in power, and those that have power are reluctant to let this go. So until we can have a deep and honest conversation as our nation, regardless about who's in power, but are the systems and structures that are set up, do they serve our interests as a country in this particular time period, we'll continue to see just the faces change, but the players will stay the same.
Thank you for your great responses on that question. We have another question from the audience. Will you please talk about the role of the media in supporting or opposing Black women's efforts in achieving political office?
Am I going first on this one too? Well, the media is, it's an institution, right? And institutions uphold much of the stereotypes and tropes within our society. And so we see the media in many cases being complicit in attacks on Black women as politicians continue to perpetuate many of the stereotypes. And so, for example, during the vice presidential search process, when it was leaked that Ed Randell had made comments about Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's ambition, and much of the media ran with that, but there was not a lot of rebuke against Randall for even having that conversation and even leaking it, right? Because it was leaked on purpose. And so it wasn't until Black women and Black women's organizations began to publicly push back against that narrative about Black women being ambitious and women being ambitious that the media began to pull away from that. So the media oftentimes is complicit. And the media oftentimes can have a media darling. There are times that they like any candidate, and there are times that they can turn on a dime. But what we see within American media is that there often is an attraction to certain Black women. If Black women, to Nadia's research, look a certain way, talk a certain way, they can be perceived more favorable by the media. And those that do not toe the line can get a more harsher type of treatment in the media. We also see it particularly with campaign advertisements. One of the things that if you know, as we begin to do some retrospective of this election cycle, particularly in many of these congressional races, there were horrible, toxic advertisement against Black women that were running congressional races in Arkansas, in Illinois, in other states. Many of these women ran against white men, and we see that their advertisement and the language that was used to describe these women, to describe the issues, to misrepresent their stances on particularly Black Lives Matter and defunding the police was often discussed in local markets. And so we have to, looking at how many of these women lost, particularly in races that even Charlie Cook called as toss ups. For those of you who know Charlie Cook, he doesn't call toss ups very often, but when he calls some of these races toss ups, and then all of a sudden, when there's a negative ad or there was some type of conversation in the media about one of these candidates and their stance, particularly when it came to issues around defunding police, we see that many of these women lost in landslides. And so I think we have to hold the media accountable for how Black women are discussed, for how women are discussed. Um, and and I think Black women, we saw the model. And so media didn't respond until we saw Black women publicly in open letters and interviews and social media pushing back. So I think Black women will continue to do that and hold the media to be accountable in the treatment of Black women as politicians and candidates.
And I'll quickly add some. Pearl mentioned some of my own research on the politics of appearance of Black women, and there is a definite preference that the media and Americans seem to have for what Black women should look like. And Black women have been calling this out, right? So Stacey Abrams has famously said people don't think she's viable because she's dark skinned, unmarried, with natural hair. Kamala Harris has been publicly called one of the most attractive politicians and has made several top 10 lists of the most attractive people on the Hill or running for office. But some other, I think, where I'd love to shift our attention to is how Black women are crafting this message for themselves. So they're using new forms of media, like their own social media pages, to speak back to and to speak back to how the media is portraying them, and to really craft their own message, right? So if the media is not going to provide this outlet, they themselves can get out this messaging on their social media pages or talking to Black-owned press and other press that are seen as more favorable to them, getting word out through their own, again, indigenous networks. Those are people that are going to show up and support them. Thinking about, again, church networks, social organizations such as Black sororities, belonging to an historically Black college or university alumni association, right? So Black women are bypassing these more traditional features of the media and are speaking to those that are most likely going to vote and elect them.
And I don't have a lot to say on this subject, but I think on the media more broadly, one of the things I found most interesting in this moment, particularly over the summer with all the protests, is the ways in which the media was forced to think about new ways of talking about this. So I never heard the word white supremacy so much as during those protests, because that was the language of the movements, or thinking about the questions of police violence and things like that. And then I think the reality of demands to have more, particularly Black women's voices and faces on TV. I think we can see that as a shift. So I do think change is possible in the media, but I do think overall the media, I mean, I do think overall it's a system that is adverse to taking risk, and often doesn't want to be too different from what other people are doing. So you often hear the same thing across mainstream media platforms. And the last thing, I think the social media point is really important. That it's a new way of people connecting, and it has real ability to reach broadly and build connections. But I think for particularly for organizers and social movements, it has created some challenges too about what those connections mean, right? What is the depth of those connections if they're just through social media?
So I think as we approach the last couple minutes of the panel, I'd just like the panelists to reflect on what's next. How do we keep elected officials accountable? What's next for Black women? How might we learn from the past, from what Black women have done previously?
I think we can expect Black women to continue the fight. So having Kamala Harris at the bottom of the ticket does not mean that we've arrived to the promised land. Instead, it means that we need to continue to fight, that when Black women's voices are heard and acknowledged, there can be some change. So not taking anything away from this historic first that Kamala Harris, as the first Black woman and South Asian woman, has achieved. But it's also putting this in context that there are still so many pressing things that are happening to Black women today, and that their material realities will not be changed by who's sitting in second in command. And so, what Black women must continue to do is to do the things that they've already been doing, and that is to continue to put pressure, and then to do things themselves, right? Not to expect the Democratic Party to one day open up their eyes, or even the Republican Party, right, to open up their eyes and say, "Wow, thank you, Black women. Now come have a seat at our table and tell us about all the things that you want to change." That Black women have to actively do these things for themselves. And then my last note is that I think we should change America, right? Us writ large. So we need to think about who we are supporting, what candidates we think are viable, who are we giving our donations to, how are we talking about candidates and policies, and are we allowing other groups outside of our Indigenous communities to set the agenda for us? And that takes some real deep contemplative soul searching and some actions behind instead of being active consumers of politics as opposed to being passive consumers.
I echo everything Nadia just said, and I think what I think we're going to see is more of this continued activism, particularly on the local level. I think what has happened over the last year has been an opportunity for people to really begin to understand the local is really where the action is. Um, and so I'm expecting to see not just only an increased number of Black women running for these positions, but also this continued activism around much of the local implementation of these policies. I hope to see even more Black women really actively go after Secretary of State elections. I think one of the things that this election cycle has helped us understand is the value of the Secretary of State. Um, if we don't have a Voting Rights Act, then it comes down to the Secretary of State, because they control that election. So if you have a Secretary of State who values voting, you're not going to see the voter purges. You're not going to see limitations to who can access an absentee ballot in the midst of a pandemic. Um, and you're going to see more commitment, particularly some of the examples what we saw in Houston with the more innovative ways that people were able to vote through drive through drop off of ballots and those type of things. When you have people who value voting and citizenship in Secretary of State offices. I'm also encouraged to see many of the women who did not win in Congress, these congressional races, many of them were first time candidates for anything, and they were raising millions of dollars. So we know that money is a major component, but there's also other factors that contribute to women running. So I'm hoping to see many of those women again if not in a congressional race, if they run for something or stay engaged in the political arena. So I think we are going to hear more voices, not just only in on the level of activists, but also those that are running as candidates and engaged at that level of the political spectrum. So I think it's going to be an exciting time because 2 years will be here very soon where we'll see many of these races again, many of these same candidates again. So I think the next years are going to be quite interesting to see how these women position themselves for success moving forward.
And I would just add, I think, for Black women who been engaged in this political activism and doing grassroots work at the same time, that two-pronged approach is, I think, going to continue to be essential. I think it's going to be essential to hold the Democratic Party's feet to the fire around policy issues. But I also think it's going to be essential to build political power outside of simply the Democratic Party, because I think whether it's local issues, regional things, thinking about national connections, international connections, I think that's the real sort of resource that then can influence political parties. And I think the one lesson from this election is that you can have a concerted electoral policy as a grassroots organization or practice that has an impact, but that doesn't have to be the totality of your work. And I think for grassroots organizations and people who aren't necessarily simply seeking political office, but engage in the political process, how do you maintain that will be the real challenge going forward. How do you both engage in electoral politics while also keeping grassroots and building those initiatives on multiple levels? So, and I think we all need to figure out where we're going to do the work to continue that effort.
Thank you all for your insightful comments and thoughts during this panel. I wish we could go longer, but I know you are all very busy people. And so we are at the 1:33 mark. And I want to thank our audience for being with us. And I apologize for the questions that we weren't able to ask, but we certainly appreciate your engagement. Thank you all for spending your Tuesday with us. And thank you again to our panelists for your awesome insight and your work, the work that you do. So thank you again. I hope you all have a great day and a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye.